Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It always cracks me up. You guys are so quiet. And then my afternoon class, my 12:20 class, I come in here and it sounds like a party's going. What is this, too early in the morning or something? Just more laid back crowd in here, huh? We were talking about Hoover and the Great Depression on Monday. And as I pointed out, his initial reaction to it was to do nothing. At most, they were trying to bring business together to voluntarily fight the Depression. He assumed that state and local charities could actually handle it. That was a gross miscalculation. Most states and most cities went bankrupt during the Depression. Many of them had no money to provide relief. Church organizations that normally stepped in went broke. Now, Hoover, in the second half of his administration, does become more active. He tried to do several things to combat the Depression. He convinced Congress to pass a $1.5 billion appropriations bill for new construction, government construction. You know, that creates jobs. They created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was to lend money to the states and the corporations to get kick-started, to get back on their feet. And he passed a new tariff to try and protect farmers, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Is that Hawley or Smoot back there? Sounds like a country western duo, doesn't it? All of these things, even though they're trying, they backfire. That $1.5 billion in appropriations, a conservative Congress spends $300 million of it. And no way to impact the Depression. And as far as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which the Democrats will use later in the New Deal quite effectively, they should get. Gifford Pinchot was denied money as governor of Pennsylvania because he couldn't put up collateral. What should he do? Put up Pittsburgh for collateral? If we don't pay it back, you can keep it. And even the tariff backfires. Leads other countries to put up protective tariffs, and it hurts American agriculture. So even when he tried to do something, it failed. In the second half of his administration, the image of the American businessman and upper-class people like Hoover had plummeted. Far from being seen as great men, Hoover, and the Wall Street types in particular, were now blamed for the crisis. Humorist Will Rogers remarked, if someone bit an apple and found a worm in it, Hoover would get the blame. And there was a popular rhyme during the Depression. Remember, Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury. Mellon pulled the whistle, Hoover rang the bell. Wall Street gave the signal, and the country went to hell. Kind of catchy, isn't it? To the average American, Hoover seemed cold and uncaring. And nothing is going to cement that image in the American mind as much as the so-called bonus march. Now, in 1924, long before the Depression, Congress passes the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, or as a lot of people called it, the Bonus Act. They were going to pay a long overdue bonus to Great War veterans. But like many Congresses, they were going to put it off to future Congresses to pay for it. They passed the bill in 1924. The veterans won't get their bonus till 1945. Yeah, I know. Don't hold your breath, huh? By the way, what's ironic about that? That's the year World War II ends, yeah. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Now, you're out of work, you're living in a cardboard box, and you're feeding your family rats and garbage. You want to wait till 1945 for your bonus? No. Oh, yeah. They definitely knew it was coming. They just didn't want to wait 13 more years for it. So in the spring of 1932, desperate, out-of-work veterans began to congregate on Washington, D.C. to petition Congress to pay the bonus early. They called it a petition in boots. Now, many of them left in large contingents, sponsored by veterans groups. Remember, in World War I, they had been called the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. As a pun on that, they called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the BEF. But the press and the American public called them the Bonus Marchers. Eventually, about 17,000 veterans and their families, total of about 60,000 people, congregate on Washington and pretty much put up a tent city. Now, most of them congregate in a swampy area known as Anacostia Flats. Some of them, though, do cross the river and occupy then empty government buildings. But nobody's tearing anything up or anything. They're there to exercise their rights as Americans to petition their government. But they're going to be treated rather hostilely by the Hoover administration. Now, the police chief of Washington, Pelham Glassford, was a veteran himself and quietly supplied the veterans with cots, tents, medical supplies. They even ran electrical wiring out to the camp. But Hoover has a very cold attitude. He actually refuses to meet with them. You figure the last thing he could do, is at least sit down and talk to him, right? What kind of public image do you think that projects? Now, they're just hungry, desperate people. But Hoover and the then Chief of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, both saw the veterans as dangerous radicals, communist revolutionaries. They weren't anything like that. They were hungry, desperate veterans. And on top of that, they went out of their way to make sure that nobody radicalized the movement. If anybody from the right or started trying to cause trouble in the camp or proselytize, the veterans got rid of them. Well, they forced them out of the camp, they didn't dump them. They didn't want this to be painted by any radical ideology, whether it was far right or far left. Now, everybody knew how these people ended up coming out. It was obvious that the House of Representatives would vote to pay the money early. But the Senate would vote against it. And even if the Senate voted for it, Hoover announced that he would veto it. Which again, was honestly on his part, this is I don't know why Hoover probably did because the business kept his mouth shut and let the Senate to do his dirty work. And it played out the way everybody thought it would. In June, the bonus bill passes the House 211 to 176. And 3 days later, on the 17th, it fails in the Senate by the overwhelming margin of 62 to 18. Now, the bonus marchers hung around over the summer, trying to get the bill reintroduced, trying to get their allies to get the Senate and Hoover to reconsider. Yeah, this is the bonus camp. That better. It's basically a tent city. They built some shanties and all that, and some people were actually living out of their cars there.
What was Hoover's reason for wanting to veto it and not approve it?
They were afraid of what it would do to the budget. Because the bill would have cost several $billion, and the government was committed to cutting back on the budget. Which was a wrong thing to do, quite frankly, because paying the money would have helped stimulate the economy. But they were following what was then, supposed to be anyway, the standard practice in dealing with the Depression. And by the way, his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, doesn't like the bill either for the same reason. It'll be passed over his concerns. But it was mostly because they were afraid of Britain. And here's some of the little inhabitants of the bonus march camp. Notice, can you read the signs? That one says Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. And this one down here says, hard times are still hoovering over us. And a bad pun, but. Now, had Hoover simply waited for fall and then winter, the camp probably would have dispersed on its own. Back by fall, a lot of the bonus marchers planned to leave anyway. You want to spend outside in Washington in the winter? But because both Hoover and MacArthur were convinced they were dangerous radicals, they provoked a confrontation. On the 28th of July, police shoot and kill 2 veterans. And tempers flare. Hoover and MacArthur panic, and Hoover orders MacArthur to clear the veterans out of the vacant government buildings, some of them in squatting. He said nothing about attacking the bonus marcher camp. Just clear them out of the government buildings across the river that some of them had occupied. MacArthur, it wouldn't be the first time or last time in his career, disobeyed presidential orders. Not only cleared them out of the government buildings, he crossed the river and attacked the camp. They even had 6 tanks with them, led by George Patton. It was a terrible sight, folks. American soldiers attacking American veterans. Fifty-five veterans are injured, 135 arrested, and a baby is killed. Then they burn the camp. There's the cavalry and tanks massing to disperse the bonus army. I'm sorry, the photo's kind of blurred, but that's when I could actually find what was going on. And here's the burning camp after the forced eviction. MacArthur later claimed he did it to prevent a communist revolution. And in all honesty, folks, there was no way in hell a communist revolution was brewing in that camp. Hoover will take the blame. President, you take the blame for these things. It's part of the job. And it added to his unpopularity and his image of being cool and uncaring. Now, if you notice, 1932 is an election year, isn't it? So Hoover will be running for re-election a few months after the bonus march. There are several prominent Democrats lining up to challenge Hoover. They see him correctly as very vulnerable. Now, the leading contender going into the Democratic convention in Chicago that year was the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And there's another New Yorker with his hat in the ring. Former governor of New York and former presidential candidate, Al Smith. The very powerful Speaker of the House, John Nance Garner, a Texas conservative, also is vying for the nomination. And a senator from California, William McAdoo. Now, going into the convention, FDR actually had over half the delegates. And that was the nomination for him. But the Democrats back then liked to shoot themselves in the foot. They required a 2/3 majority to win the nomination. It meant when you finally picked a candidate, the party was largely unified behind them, but it also meant they usually had to go through several ballots at every convention to find a candidate. Back then, it was still a tradition in the Democratic Party that the candidate did not attend the convention. You were supposed to be seen as being above campaigning, politicking. You waited for the convention to tell you that they wanted you as their nominee. So none of the candidates are there. All of the maneuvering is being done by their campaign managers. And Roosevelt had one of the absolute best, James Farley. Not the nicest guy in the world, very astute. The biggest threat came from Smith. He's not going to back down, and his delegates aren't going to surrender their votes to Roosevelt. So if you're Farley, what do you do to undercut Smith and get the nomination for FDR? You do what candidates have done throughout history, Democrat or Republican. You got three challengers. How do you eliminate them? How do you eliminate one of them? Get their support. You offer them a position on the ticket. They offer John Nance Garner the vice president. He accepts. McAdoo, seeing what's going on, drops. And the delegates for Garner or McAdoo combined with FDR's nomination on the fourth ballot. Yeah. Happy days are here again. In the midst of a depression. Oh, back then, yeah.
Yeah, I never heard
Nobody's heard, yeah, you guys never
that.
heard.
Can't be the Happy Days on
No, had nothing to do with Ozzy or any of that, yeah. No lightweight. What the American people wanted and what they needed. They didn't want a president running around like he was conducting a funeral dirge. They wanted hope. They wanted hope. They wanted somebody that said, things are going to get better and times are going to get percent of the popular vote and damn near all of the electoral votes. It was a huge victory. How could Reader's Digest be so wrong? How is their poll so off? I gave you a hint when I told you about it. Well, use deductive reasoning. How did they conduct the poll? What did I say? Telephone, remember that part? I walked in here this morning, everybody's staring at those. I thought that's one word you would remember. They conducted a telephone poll. So why was the poll off?
They only ask people with a telephone.
And you're in the middle of a depression, right? So yeah, they only asked people that weren't suffering that much. Middle and upper class people. If you're living in a Hooverville, You don't have a telephone, do you? than Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt. Now, one was his marriage to his very distant cousin Eleanor. They were like seventh or eighth cousins. Eleanor was the one that had the social conscience. Their first date, she insisted Franklin take her to a soup kitchen she was volunteering at. And their first date consisted of both of them working in a soup kitchen, dispensing food to the poor. Roosevelt began to imbibe a lot of that from Eleanor. She began to change him, sensitize him to what it was like for the other 95%. But he at least can present the image of it. He has big, heavy steel braces on his legs. They basically hold him up. He couldn't stand without the braces. And from sheer strength and sheer willpower, he could make it look like he was walking a few steps. You know, sort of dragging himself like this, and usually propped up by an aide. Now, it's not true that the American public did not know he had polio or that he was restricted to a wheelchair. There was sort of a general consensus not to bring it up. He was only filmed maybe once in his entire presidency sitting in his wheelchair. In his entire presidency, he only made one direct remark on it. So it was known, but it was really played down. And the American public probably never suspected just how ill he really was from it. he proved that somebody with a disability like that could not only be president, could be a great president. Those are my two beefs with the statue. But aside from that, I'm glad he's got one. They do have his little dog with him, man. I forget what it was, a little dog about this big named Follow. Now, in 1928, he re-enters politics and wins election as governor of New York. And by the way, here's the other woman, Lucy Mercer. And proving historians cannot count, it is often known as the second 100 days. As I said, there's no overall ideology behind the New Deal, but there are three basic principles guiding it. The three R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Those are the three R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. You're going to find all three in both New Deals, but the mix is going to be a little different. First New Deal is going to emphasize more relief and reform. Take care of the initial emergency, get people housed and fed, and reform the system that had broken. The second New Deal will focus a little bit more on recovery and reform. So all three R's are in both New Deals, but you got slightly different emphasis. Now, the New Deal starts basically the minute Roosevelt takes office. one of the first things they do is close the banks to prevent further runs on them. One of the things that happened during that lame duck period between November and March, there had been another run on the banks, and thousands more banks had collapsed. So Roosevelt, Congress, announced what they call a bank holiday. How's that for using a positive term? They closed the banks. Roosevelt then goes on the radio, the primary medium back then for addressing the American public, with the first of his so-called fireside chats. Roosevelt had a knack talking to the American people, for telling them in terms they would understand what he planned to do and how it would affect them. He was relaxed, had a sense of humor, didn't talk down to people. And by the way, he was not actually by a fireplace during the chats. Roosevelt, being confined to a wheelchair, and the White House being pretty much a fire trap back then, was never left alone in a room with an open fireplace. But it sounds good on radio. You hear the nice crackling fire and all that. Or my crackling phone. Let me guess, somebody trying to sell me something I don't want, don't need. Oh yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Roosevelt tells them when the banks reopen, their money will be safe. And amazingly, when the banks reopen, there is no run on the banks. In fact, deposits outnumber withdrawals. Congress had responded by passing several new laws. The Glass-Steagall Banking Bill went a long way to reforming the corrupt and reckless practices of Wall Street. Again, anybody who tells you that talks about useless government regulation, look at the Glass-Steagall Act. In terms of the fact that without it, Wall Street caused a Great Depression. They passed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. For the first time, your money is guaranteed, if it's in a Federal Reserve Bank, your money is protected by the government. If the bank goes belly up, it only covered basically the person's bank account. The insurance only covered accounts up to about $5,000, which back then was a lot of money. Today, somewhere I think, I could be wrong, and I don't have that much money in the bank account. Somewhere around 250 or 300,000 a day is probably the most rate. But for the first time, your money is relatively safe as long as it's in an FDIC bank. And on the 7th of April, 1933, happy days were back again. Congress repeals the Volstead Act. Congress will soon repeal the 18th Amendment. The 18th is the only amendment to the Constitution that ever been revoked. control
of one of his most trusted advisors, Harry Hopkins. And Hopkins has a $500 million budget.
Hopkins.
Is honest, envoy to both Churchill and Stalin. And both of them know that if Hopkins says something,